Today's daf is Kaf Bet, but we are starting on Kaf Aleph Amud Bet, the second side of Kaf Aleph in the middle of the page, where it says Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mivarech Lifnehem Ul Acharehem, which is where we left off yesterday. What we had here was the discussion of Balkari. The Balkari is a person who had a seminal emission, either because he had marital relations or otherwise, and this individual is prohibited from saying Berachot and studying Torah because of Takanat Ezra, because Ezra HaSofer, who was the leader of the Jews who came to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, in the time of the second temple, made a special decree forbidding the Balkari from doing these activities in order to sort of promote the concept of the sanctity and reverence that a person should have when they say Hashem's name and when they study Torah. However, as we saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda was a little more liberal. So whereas the Tanakh Kama, the anonymous teacher in the Mishnah, said that the Balkari may not recite blessings before or after the Shema, and may not recite blessings before he eats, Rabbi Yehuda was more lenient, he was more liberal, and he said that the Balkari can recite a bracha before he eats, and he can recite the brachot before and after the Shema. So that's a significant difference. And now the Gemara is going to try to tackle what is the reason why Rabbi Yehuda is so liberal and lenient about this halakha. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mivarech Lefneim Ul Acharehem. We're going to go a little bit faster today so we can catch up with the daf. So Lememrad de Kasafa Rabbi Yehuda Balkari Mutar B'Divrei Torah. Is this to suggest that Rabbi Yehuda rejects the whole concept that a Balkari is forbidden to study Torah? He just doesn't believe in it. Therefore, he says that the Balkari can read the Shema normally, can say the brachot before and after, because he doesn't subscribe to the whole concept. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, but Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, "Minayin leBalkari shasur b'divrei Torah." Where do we get this idea that a Balkari cannot study Torah? Shene'emar, as it says in the Torah, "V'hodatam livanecha v'livnei vanecha." This was just a few weeks ago in Parashat V'etchanan. You should let your children and your children's children know about what you experienced at Sinai. V'samich le yom asher amadta. Now it tells us to inform our children about the Torah, to teach our children Torah, and then it says, what specifically should you emphasize to them? The day you stood before Hashem your God at Mount Sinai. Ma lehalan bale kiryan asurin. Just like over there at Har Sinai, a Balkari was not permitted. Remember, Moshe Rabbeinu told everybody they had to separate from their wives for 3 days. Afkan, Bale Kiryan Asurin. So too here, those who had marital relations are not allowed to study Torah. In other words, what is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi basically saying? He's saying we want to retain the sense of reverence that the Jews had at Har Sinai when they received the Torah every time they learned Torah. That's a very lofty goal, and therefore Balkari is prohibited. So how can Rabbi Yehuda deny this juxtaposition in the pasuk? The pasuk first tells us to teach Torah to our children, and then tells us that we have to remember Har Sinai, with the implication being that when we teach, we have to teach with the same level of kedusha, the same level of holiness that they learned at Har Sinai. So how can Rabbi Yehuda deny this? V'chitema Rabbi Yehuda lo darish semuchim. Maybe you'll say that Rabbi Yehuda rejects the concept of simuchim. Simuchim is the concept that when you have two pesukim next to each other, two verses, two ideas that are one right after the other in the Torah, that we learn a connection between the two ideas because of their juxtaposition, because they're next to each other. Should we assume that he doesn't subscribe to that? And because he doesn't subscribe to that idea, therefore, he doesn't believe that just because it tells you to teach Torah and then it tells you to remember Mount Sinai, that means you have to teach Torah in a way that reminds us of Har Sinai. He doesn't believe that that's true. So therefore, and it's because of that difference, that methodological difference, so to speak, that he doesn't subscribe to the idea of Balkari. Ve'amar Rav Yosef, but Rav Yosef said, "Afilu man delo darish simuchim b'chol Torah, b'mishne Torah darish." But that's not true, because even somebody who generally doesn't use juxtaposition, simuchim, to learn things. In other words, even somebody who believes that in general having two verses next to one another doesn't mean that we learn from one to the other. In Mishneh Torah and Sefer Dvarim, even such a person agrees that we do learn from one to the other, because Sefer Dvarim is a potpourri of different things. there's a reason why one is related to the other, why one is mentioned before or after the other. So the assumption is in the book of Devarim that juxtaposition is significant, even if one is conservative about that usually. Okay, how do we know that? Because we know that Rabbi Yehuda, in fact, does not usually use the proximity of two verses to learn one from the other. But nonetheless, when it comes to the book of Devarim, he does. Ditanya, as we learned in a Baraita, Ben Azai Omer, Ben Azai said, Ne'emar mechashefa lo techayeh. This is in Parashat Mishpatim. It says, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. In other words, you should execute somebody who practices magic. V'ne'emar kol shochevim be'ema mot yumat. And it says, right after mentioning the sorceress, it says, anybody who lies with an animal in an inappropriate way is to be put to death. Samechu inyan lo, lomar ma shochevim be'ema beskila, af mechasheva nami beskila. Now it doesn't tell us in the Torah what the death penalty is for a mechashefa, for a sorceress, a witch. It doesn't tell us. But a witch is mentioned right next to the prohibition of bestiality. So therefore, Ben Azai says, just like somebody who commits bestiality, which death penalty do we impose? Sekila, which is the most stringent one, stoning. So too, the witch, we impose the most stringent death penalty of skila. But where does Ben Azai get that? From the fact that the two Pesukim are next to each other. That's called Simuchim. In fact, we learned Simuchim from Simuchim La'ad Le'olam that we read every Shabbat. Asuyim Be'emet V'yashar. So Amar Le Rabbi Yehuda said to Ben Azai, V'chim ipnei shesamchu inyan lo, notzi lazel skila. Just because you have two verses next to each other, we're going to give the harshest death penalty to the witch? How could you do that? How could you use just that juxtaposition to learn such a weighty conclusion? I mean, how can you do that? Ella ovi, he says, but you're right about your conclusion. The conclusion's right. I don't like your method. I don't think that just because two verses are next to each other necessarily means we can learn from one to the other. But I happen to agree that the machashefa does get the penalty of sikila, of stoning. It's just that I learned it a different way. Ella ovi yid'oni bechlal kol ha'mechashefim hayu. Because ovi yid'oni, which is at the very end of, I want to say Parashat Emor, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, Parashat Kedoshim. Okay? At the end of Parashat Kedoshim, it mentions Ovi Yid'oni. Why are they singled out from among all other magic workers? In other words, all other people who engage in these occult magical practices that are punishable by death. Ovi Yid'oni were specific occult practices that had to do with trying to communicate with the dead in certain ways or whatever. So, why were they singled out? To tell us that they get sikila, that they get the death penalty of stoning. It says at the very, very end of Parashat Kedoshim that an ovi yid'oni is somebody who practices that gets the death penalty of stoning. Why? V'lama yatz'u. Okay, they were included in the category. So why were they singled out? L'hakish lein v'lomar lecha ma ovi yid'oni baskila af mechasheva baskila. To teach you that just like the Ovi Yid'oni gets the death penalty of stoning, so too the witch who's mentioned in Parashat Mishpatim gets the death penalty of stoning. So there's a different way that we learn it. We don't learn it from the juxtaposition of two verses. We learn it from the fact that two who were originally in the group, Ovi Yid'oni, who were originally in the group, were singled out and mentioned as getting the death penalty of stoning. Therefore, we generalize and we say that all sorcerers, so to speak, all people involved in those activities get stoning.
The one that converted when Yeshua came to Israel.
Who is this?
The Yidonim.
No, those are the Givonim. Givonim, yeah. So, Yidoni is a type of idolatry. So, over Mishneh Torah minalan didarish. So we see then that Rabbi Yehuda does not believe in the idea that because two verses are next to each other, we can learn from one to the other. But in the book of Dvarim, he does believe in it. How do we know that? Titania, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Nosei Adam min anusat aviv umfutat aviv, anusat beno umfutat beno. We know that one cannot marry a person who his father was married to. Okay, even if it's not their mother. So if you have a stepmother and then your father and mother get divorced, or something like that, or if your father and stepmother get divorced, or if you have a son who gets married and then the son and the daughter they get divorced, so you still can't marry the person your son was married to. You still can't marry the person your father was married to. So Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says, what about anusat aviv? What if your father sexually assaulted a woman, basically, okay? He had relations with her. Or mifutat aviv, he seduced a woman, meaning it was consensual, but your father had relations with this woman, okay? So he says, you can marry her. In other words, if later you fall in love, or your son has relations with, in whatever way, the point is he wasn't married to the woman, or your father had relations with the woman but wasn't married to her, can you marry her? The answer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is yes. Nosei adam anusat aviv. So you can. Rabbi Yehuda oser banusat aviv umufutat aviv. However, Rabbi Yehuda says anyone with whom your father had relations, even if he wasn't married to her, you can never marry her. So this is a machloket. It's an argument between Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you could marry her, and Rabbi Yehuda, who says you cannot. Now, why is that? V'amar Rav Gidal. Amarav, Rav Gidal said that Rav said, "My tamad Rabbi Yehuda." What's the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? Dechtiv lo yikach ish et eshet aviv v'lo yigalek knaf aviv. Because it says a man should not take his father's wife, meaning you can't marry a woman who is married to your father. V'lo yigalek knaf aviv, and he cannot uncover the corner of his father's garment, meaning kenaf shira aviv lo yigaleh, meaning any corner of a garment that saw his father. He cannot uncover, meaning to say any woman who his father had a relationship with, he cannot have a relationship with her. Okay? So, umimayda ba'unusat aviv kitiv. And how do you know that when it says any garment that saw his father, meaning any woman who had relations with his father, not just a woman that his father married, but any woman with whom his father had an intimate relationship, he can't be involved with her. How do you know that's what it's that's what it's referring to? This samichle, because right after that verse, it talks about v'natana isha shochevima. It talks about the case of the mifateh. It talks about the case of the man who either has relations with a woman unlawfully or consensually, but not within the framework of wedlock, basically, okay, out of wedlock having relations. So because right after the prohibition of having relations with someone with whom your father is connected, right after that is followed up with the case of having relations with women to whom you're not married. So we say that we can generalize and say, just like the verse that came afterwards was talking about a man having relations with a woman to whom he's not married, so too, when it talked about the women with whom your father had a relationship, it was including women to whom he wasn't necessarily married. You still cannot have a relationship with them. But how does Rabbi Yehuda get it? From juxtaposition. From the fact that one verse follows the previous verse.
But how do we know that the corner of the garment means...
It's a metaphor. They're assuming it's a metaphor. It's a euphemism. Yeah, they're taking it as a euphemism for the woman. So therefore, we see that Rabbi... Hekesh is when two words appear in two different verses. They're not necessarily next to each other. Okay? Here, they're right next to each other. So it's simuchim. So they could seem to have nothing to do with each other. For example, the famous case of simuchim is, it talks about shatnez and it talks about tzitzit, right next to each other. So what do we say? Obviously that it's to teach us that shatnez, that there's an exemption for shatnez and tzitzit if you had the wool string of techelet with, let's say, a linen garment or something like that, because they're next to each other. Now that's only in the book of Dvarim does Rabbi Yehuda use that kind of reasoning, and it happens to be, okay, so Amrei in b'mishneh Torah darish. So Rabbi Yehuda, we see in the book of Dvarim, does use the concept of simuchim. And where do we learn the idea that somebody who had a seminal emission cannot learn Torah? From simuchim, from the fact that it mentions learning Torah, and then right afterwards it mentions standing at Sinai. And that's in the book of Dvarim. It's in Parashat V'etchanan.
Except it doesn't appear to be simuchim. It appears to be clearly stated.
It's connected. Right, it's connected. It seems like it's the same topic, right?
Right. In other words, it's not. It doesn't appear to be simuchim because it clearly says that it should not. In other words, it's done through a metaphor that the father should.
Oh, you mean in the case of the father?
In the case of the father, right?
Oh, no, because you could still argue that means his wife. You could have said that the woman who sees his garment is his wife. So they're taking
that's what a corner of the garment.
Right. That it has a sexual connotation to it. But the fact that even a woman to whom he wasn't married is included, that you get from the simuchim.
Oh.
Yeah. So in this case, it's in Dvarim, it's simuchim. So we must assume that Rabbi Yehuda is going to subscribe to this idea that there's a connection between learning Torah and Mount Sinai. And therefore, why is he so liberal about the Balkari? Why is he allowing the Balkari to learn Torah? So what does the Gemara go on to say? How's it going to answer this? Yes, v'hanei smuchin mibaile leidach Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yehuda agrees there is a connection, but he interprets it differently to support a different teaching. Da'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, "Kol ha'melamed livnot Torah, male alav hakatuv ki ilu kibala mehar chorev, shenemar v'hodatam levanecha v'levnei vanecha, uchtiv batre yom asher amat lefnei Hashem Elohecha b'chorev." That anybody who teaches his son Torah, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, the correct girsah should be here, leben binot Torah. That's what the Rambam has. Anybody who teaches his grandson Torah, it's as if he stood at Sinai. Why? Because it says v'hodatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha. Okay, so it's even your grandson, not just your son, but even your grandson. It's as if he received it from Sinai because he's receiving it from a living tradition that links him back to Sinai. So that's what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is showing you, the importance of a father teaching a son and a grandfather teaching a grandson, that there's a sense of living connection. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says the connection is. I agree there's a connection between learning Torah and remembering Har Sinai. What's the connection? Oh, that a father should teach a son, that a grandfather should teach a grandson. Okay? Because that's from the Pasuk. So, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah as follows. Zav shara keri v'nida shepal tashikvat zera mishameshet v'rat adam tzrichin tevilah. Rabbi Yehuda poter. Now we have a problem. So up till now, what did we assume? Oh, so Rabbi Yehuda must reject this whole idea of Balkari. He rejects the idea of Balkari. He interprets the verses in Sefer Dvarim in a different way, and he doesn't subscribe to the whole concept that a Balkari can't learn Torah. But now we see a Mishnah that tells us, Azav. Now Azav is what you were thinking of yesterday. Azav is a person who has the different kind of emission coming from his genitals. It's not keri, it's not semen, it's something else. Okay? Or a Nida. A woman who had marital relations and then became a nida afterwards, which means she has 7 days at least of tum'ah, of impurity before she can go to the mikveh. But palata shechvat zera, because she had marital relations, sometimes that she can have a seminal emission basically later on after having had relations. Or a woman, mishameshet virat adam, or a woman who had marital relations and then shortly afterwards became a nida. Okay, she started her period shortly after that. So what do these cases have in common? What they have in common is that the man or the woman is a balkari. Okay, he had a seminal emission. She had semen come out of her. But they're tameh for a different reason. So even if they go to the mikveh, they're not going to become tahor. Because they both have tum'ah that lasts 7 days. The woman, even if she goes to the mikveh today, it's not going to do her any good. Because she's still a nida for a few more days. The man is a zav. So even if he goes to the mikveh today, he needs the whole process of a zav. The 7 clean days, and so on. So therefore...
Why are they bringing the nida with the seminal emission? I mean, doesn't
she also can become balkari from contact, from marital relations.
But a nida is impure just from the fact that she's nida.
Exactly.
Right. So,
that's the whole point of the case. The whole point of the case is that she's both. So in a case where somebody's just a balkari or a woman just had relations, she's also a balat keri, whatever you want to call it. So she has to go to the mikveh before she says berachot and before she learns Torah.
Right, so my question is that why that's irrelevant.
It is irrelevant, right, exactly.
So
in this case, because she's a nida, even if she were to go to the mikveh, it's not going to do her any good.
Right.
See, because she's still a nida. So what good is it to go?
I see.
All right. So according to the Tanakama, that's the whole chidush here. So according to the Tanakama, according to the first opinion here, even though it's not going to do her any good, in other words, she's going to go to the mikveh, she had marital relations last night, or the man is a zav, he had marital relations, now he can't learn Torah. Being a zav doesn't prevent him from learning Torah, having marital relations prevents him. So if he goes to the mikveh today, he could argue, well, what's the point of going to the mikveh? I'm not going to be tahor because I'm still a zav. So why should I bother going? Answer is, even in a case where it's not going to make him tahor, he still has to go. It's a special institution that Ezra made, that a balkari must go to the mikveh, even if it's not mitaher, even if it's not going to make him tahor. However, Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, poter. He exempts. He says, in a case where the person is not going to be tahor as a result of immersion, he doesn't have to immerse. Only in a case where that's the only tum'ah that he has, then he goes to immerse. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, basically Ezra did not innovate a whole new concept of balkari. What he did was he said, if you're a balkari, you have to go to the mikveh, assuming the mikveh is going to remove your impurity. But if it's not going to remove your impurity, then you don't go. The Tanakh Kama said, no, it's a whole new idea. Even if it's not going to remove all of your impurity, you still have to go. But what do you see from this? Ad kan lo pater Rabbi Yehuda lebazav sherakerish demikara lav bar tevilahu aval balkeri greda mechayev. But what do you see from here? That Rabbi Yehuda does believe in the concept of balkeri. Before we had jumped the gun and assumed that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't subscribe to this idea at all. But actually he does believe in it. Because what is he saying? He's saying, when do I exempt you from going to the mikveh? If you're tameh for another reason. But the assumption is, if you had marital relations and you're not tameh for another reason, that you do have to go. So he does believe in the idea of balkeri. He does believe that somebody who had marital relations can't learn Torah. He doesn't reject the idea completely. All right? So,
Would Rabbi Yehuda permit the Balkari, who's also a Zav, to learn Torah?
yes, he's exempting him. He's exempting him from the immersion. He's saying he can learn without it. V'chitema hu adin dafilo balkeri greda nami patar Rabbi Yehuda v'haydeka mepalge b'zav shira keri lo diacha kochan derabanan. Now you might argue that no, maybe Rabbi Yehuda really doesn't believe in balkeri at all. But the whole purpose of the Mishnah is to show how stringent the rabbis are. That the rabbis are so strict that even if the mikveh doesn't help you because you're tameh for another reason, even so, the rabbis require you to immerse. But really, Rabbi Yehuda would say, even if you're not tameh for another reason, you don't have to go. Meaning, he doesn't hold by it at all. That can't be true because because the last case belies that interpretation. Because the first two cases, in the first two cases, the tum'ah predates the becoming a balkeri, right? The guy was a zav already, and then he became balkeri. Then he had a seminal emission. The woman was a nida already, and then some seminal emission came out of her. So in those cases, they were tameh already, and then they became a balkeri. And the chidush is that even though the balkeri status, even though the seminal emission status came afterwards, when they were already tameh, they still have to go to the mikveh. So why do you need the third case? The third case is Masekhet Berakhot Daf, the woman who had relations and then became a nida. So her obligation to go to the mikveh as a balat keri, because of the tumat keri, came before she became nida. So it's obvious then. So why do you need the third case? If in a case where she was a nida before, and then the seminal emission happens, if there she has to go to the mikveh, then certainly when she already needed to go to the mikveh because of a seminal emission and later becomes a nida, why is that going to help her? Why is that going to help her? So there's no chidush. Okay? So leman katanila, ilemad lerabanan pshita, hashta umazav shirakeri demeikar alav bar tevilahu mechayive rabanan, mishameshev ratadam demeikar bat tevilahi lo kol sheken. Obviously, according to the rabbis, that's not a novel idea. Because if in a case where she was already tameh, and then had the seminal emission, she needs to go to the mikveh just for the seminal emission, then certainly when she had the contact, when she had the marital relations first, and she already had an obligation to go to the mikveh, and then becomes a nida, that's not going to make it any better. That's obvious, okay? But elalav Rabbi Yehudahi, certainly this is coming to teach you something according to Rabbi Yehuda. V'davkat katanila. Mishameshet v'ratanida ena tzricha tevila aval balkeri greda mechayev. So who is it a chidush for? It's a chidush for Rabbi Yehuda. Not only does Rabbi Yehuda say that when she was already a nida and then had a seminal emission, when he was already a zav and then had a seminal emission, that he doesn't have to go to the mikveh. But even in a case where the woman was had relations before when she was tehorah, and so therefore her obligation to go to the mikveh before saying berachot already existed, and then she became a nida, even then Rabbi Yehuda is exempting her from going to the mikveh before she learns Torah, before she says berachot. Okay? So therefore, we can infer from this that he certainly holds of the idea in general. He just doesn't hold from the application in this case. He only applies it to a case where the immersion in the mikveh is actually going to help the woman. If it's not going to help the woman become tahorah, then he doesn't require her to do it. If it's not going to help the man become tahor, he's not going to require him to do it. Okay, now we move on to lo tema mivarech ela meharher. So therefore we're stuck. If Rabbi Yehuda believes in this whole thing, why is he being so lenient that he allows the man who's a balkeri to say brachot before and after eating? Why is it that he allows the man to say the shema and the brachot before and after? So it says, oh, maybe he only meant meharher. Maybe he only meant he could say it in his mind. He wasn't being that liberal. He's not saying that he can actually recite the Shema and the Brachot. He's saying he can say it in his mind. That's more flexible. Really? Omi itle le Rabbi Yehuda hirur. Where do you see the idea that Rabbi Yehuda says that one who's not allowed to say a certain passage can do it in his mind? That's a nice way to get around the problem that Rabbi Yehuda seems too lenient here. So maybe if we say that he only meant you could say it in your mind, it attenuates the leniency. But that doesn't seem to be true. Because the V'hatanya, we learned in a Baraita, Bal keri shein lo mayim lidbol. If a balkari does not have any water available to him to immerse, korek kriyat shema ve'eno mivarech lefanea v'lo la'achareh, ve'ochel pito u'mvarech le'achareh ve'eno mivarech lefanea. Aval meharer belibo ve'eno motzi b'sfatav divrei Rabbi Meir. If a balkari doesn't have the option to go to the mikveh, he doesn't have a mikveh available, what should he do? So it says he should read the Shema, not say the blessing before or after. He should eat his food. He should say the blessing after, but not before. This is exactly what we said in the Mishnah, what a balkari is supposed to do. But he says it all in his heart, according to Rabbi Meir. He shouldn't say it aloud. Okay, that's exactly what we saw in our Mishnah. That's the position of the Mishnah. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ben kach u ben kach motzi b'sfatav. Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? He can do everything and he can say it out loud. There's no problem. So that's as clear as day. Okay, so if Rabbi Yehuda does subscribe to this idea of balkari, he has a liberal view in which one can say the Shema aloud, one can say the brachot of the Shema aloud, and one can say brachot before and after food aloud. Okay, this is what Rabbi Yehuda says. So he still must have the concept that you can't learn Torah when you're a balkari, but we don't know exactly when he applies that yet. So Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Asa'an Rabbi Yehuda ki hilchot derech eretz. What happened here is that Rabbi Yehuda considers saying brachot before and after eating, and saying the Shema, and saying the blessings before and after the Shema, like the halachot of derech eretz. What that means, as we're going to see, is that there were different opinions about what you can and can't learn when you're a balkari. Everybody agrees that there's some leeway in terms of learning when you're a balkari. And Hilchot Derech Eretz is a Masekhet, actually, that talks about the practices of the Chachamim in terms of eating, in terms of socializing, and things that are like social rules that the rabbis observed. There's a Masekhet Derech Eretz. It's one of the small Masechtot. But the point is that something which is simple, straightforward, not deep, he allows you to do. And he considers things that we do every day, like saying the Shema, like saying Berachot. These are not major things where you have to be so reverent that if you didn't go to the mikveh, you can't do them. So he equates these regular brachot to Hilchot Derech Eretz. They're like studying something that's studied on the surface. That's not a deep studying. And where do we see a basis for such a distinction? As follows. Detanya, as we learned in a Braita, v'hodatam levanecha v'levnei vanecha uchtiv bater yom asher amat lefnei Hashem Elohecha bechorev ma lahalan. It was because we know that juxtaposition of verses. Teach your children and grandchildren Torah, remind them of Mount Sinai. Ma lahalan be'ema uvyira uvirtet uvzi'ah. Just like in the case of Har Sinai at Mount Sinai, the people studied Torah be'ema, with awe, with fear. Birtet, they were shaking in their boots. They were afraid. Okay, it was a fearsome experience. Afkan be'emau v'yirau birtet v'ziyah. The same thing here, that when we study Torah, it has to be done with great reverence. Mikan amru. This is where we get the idea. Hazavim v'mitzoraim ubayin al nidot mutarim lekrot b'Torah b'nevim u'b'ktuvim lishnot b'mishnah b'gemara u'b'halachot u'b'agadot. Therefore, any tameh person, any impure person, a zav, mitzorah, somebody who had relations with a nida herself, anybody can study Torah, Torah shebechtav, Tanakh, Gemara, Mishnah, anything. Aval balei keryan asurin. But somebody who's a balkari, somebody who had marital relations, basically, is not allowed, because marital relations comes, a seminal emission, being a balkari, comes from a sense of levity. It's a state of mind. It's something voluntary. It has to do with where your mind is. If a person's a balkari, either it happens in sleep or it happens through marital relations, but it happens because the person's mind is not fully reverent. Rabbi Yossi says, Shoneu beregiliyut. He can study things that he's familiar with. In other words, he can, like, for example, recite Mishnah by heart. If he knows Mishnayot by heart, he can recite them by heart. Ubilvad shelo yatzeh et Mishnah. Provided that he not start delving into the reasons for the Mishnah and teaching and analyzing, going into depth. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer Matzia hu et Mishnah ve'eno matzia et Gemara. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef says he can even study the Mishnah in depth, but he shouldn't go into the Gemara. That's too advanced. Actually, incidentally, on this entire page, every time it says the word Gemara, Rashi has the different version. Rashi has the version Midrash. Okay? So just FYI. Rabbi Natan ben Avishalom Omer. Rabbi Natan ben Avishalom, notice how his parents very wisely didn't name him Avshalom. They named him Avishalom. Omer Af Matzia et Gemara. He can even go into the explanations of the Gemara, which according to Rashi should say et Midrash. Ubelvad shelo yomar azkarot shebo. As long as he doesn't mention the azkarot. He doesn't mention the names of Hashem that come up. Because what's the reason why there's a problem with Midrash? Because it mentions many verses of the Torah with Hashem's name. So as long as you can even go into the Midrash, Rashi explains that, you can even go into the Midrash, into explaining in depth, as long as you don't mention Hashem's name in the verses. Rabbi Yochanan Asandlar, Rabbi Yochanan, the shoemaker, Talmidosh Rabbi Akiva, the student of Rabbi Akiva, Mishum Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lo Yikanes La Midrash Kol Ikar, he said in the name of Rabbi Akiva that he shouldn't go into Midrash at all, meaning he shouldn't go into these areas of analysis, whether it be Gemara or it be Midrash. When you're going in depth, he shouldn't do it at all. Some say lo yikanes lebet midrash kol ikar. Some say it means you can't go into the Beit Midrash. The first version says you can go into the Beit Midrash and listen to other people talking about Torah, but you yourself shouldn't be involved. According to the second version, you shouldn't even lo yikanes lebet midrash kol ikar. You shouldn't even go in to listen to the discussions in the Beit Midrash. So as we see, there's some different parameters here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer shonehu behilchot derech eretz. Rabbi Yehuda says he can learn the halachot of derech eretz, which are simple, practical guidelines that relate to a person's conduct in day-to-day life that the rabbis had. Masekhet Rabbi Yehuda Shirakeri. Once upon a time, Rabbi Yehuda saw Keri. He had a seminal emission. Vayam alech al gava nahar. There he was walking with the students along the river. Amrulo talmidav Rabbeinu. They said, our teacher, we understand that you're tamei. You cannot teach us Gemara. You can't go in depth. But shenelanu perek echad bilchot derech eretz. You yourself said that you can study the halachot of derech eretz. Please teach us. Yarad v'taval. He went down into the mikveh. He went into the river and he immersed first. V'shana lahem, and then he taught them. Amrulo, they said to him, lo kach limadtanu. Rabbeinu, did you not teach us, our teacher? Shonehu bilchot derech eretz. That a balkari, somebody who had a seminal emission, is allowed to learn the halachot of derech eretz, the simple practical guidelines of derech eretz, even without going into the mikveh. So what did he say? Amar lahem afal pisha mekilani al achirim machmirani al atzmi. I might impose stringency on myself. That doesn't mean I'm going to be stringent for others. So for myself, I'll go to the mikveh even if I'm going to teach something simple. But for others, I'll be lenient and tell them if you're going to learn something very simple, you don't have to go to the mikveh. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera hayomer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said, and divrei Torah mekablin tuma. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera denies the whole concept that Ezra told us not to study Torah when we're tamei. He says, tefillah, yes. To not pray, perhaps that Ezra prohibited to a balkari. But to study Torah, and divrei Torah mekablin tuma, the words of Torah are impervious to impurity. They cannot become impure. And therefore, one who is tamei, even a balkari, even somebody who had a seminal emission, is allowed to study Torah. And in fact, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, it would seem, and the way that the Rambam presents it, it would seem that one could get the wrong idea from imposing a law like this on the study of Torah, as if the words of Torah are mekablim tum'ah, are going to become impure as a result of us studying them when we're a balkari. So, Masekhet Talmid Echad, there was once a story, Shaya megamgem lemala me Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. A student was reading and he was mumbling. When he would come to Hashem's name, he would mumble a little bit because he must have been a balkari. He didn't want to say the psukim clearly. Amar le bini, he said to him, Petach picha v'ya'iru dvarecha, open your mouth so your words can be light. Okay, so your words can be bright, can be enlightening. So, in other words, say them clearly, because he understood that the reason why he didn't want to say words of Torah was because he was a balkari. And he said, "She'en divrei Torah mekablin tum'ah." Don't worry about the words of Torah becoming impure as a result of your saying them. Just open your mouth and say them. Shene'emar halo kol dvari ka'esh ne'um Hashem, because Hashem said, "My word is like fire." Ma esh eno mekabel tum'ah af divrei Torah inam mekablim tum'ah. Just like fire cannot become impure, so too the words of Torah cannot become impure. Amar Mar, we go back to the master, Matzeh Mishnah, Veno Matzeh Gemara. We saw before that it said you can teach the Mishnah, but you cannot delve into the Gemara, or according to Rashi, that would mean the Midrash. Misayale le Rabbi Eli. This supports what Rabbi Eli said. The Amar Rabbi Eli, because Rabbi Eli said Amar Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov in the name of Rabbi Acha, and in the name of Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov, Mishum Rabbeinu, in the name of Rabbeinu. Halacha matziat Mishnah, ve'no matziat Gemara. The law is you can teach the Mishnah or you can delve into the Mishnah, but not into the Gemara or the Midrash, according to Rashi. Katanae. In fact, it's a dispute. Matziat Mishnah, ve'no matziat Gemara. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said you can study Mishnah, but you can't go into Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel Omer, Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, Zev v'zeh asur, v'amri la, Zev v'zeh mutar. So there are actually three opinions. One said you can do Mishnah but not Gemara. One said that you can't do either of them, and one said that you can do both. So how can you have three opinions? Well, it's easy in the Gemara, in Talmud. It's easy. Okay, Manda Mar Zev Zasor. The one that says both of them are prohibited, Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, because we learned before in the Breita, Rabbi Yochanan ben Sandlar says you shouldn't go into Midrash at all. You shouldn't be learning any Torah Shebal Peh. Manda Amar Zev Zeh Mutar, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. The one who says you can do Mishnah and Gemara, or Mishnah and Midrash, that's what Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said. He was the one who said that you can learn any Torah that you want because Torah does not become impure. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, Nahug al makan etlat tzabeh, that the custom of the world is to follow the opinion of three scholars, even though those scholars were de'ot yachid. They were individual opinions, and the majority opinion disagreed. What are they? Ke Rabbi Eli bereshit hagez, ke Rabbi Yoshia bekilayim, ke Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera b'divrei Torah. This is, we go according to Rabbi Eli when it comes to Reshit Hagez, bringing the first shearing of the sheep. Okay? We go according to Rabbi Yoshia when it comes to Kilayim, planting diverse seeds. And we go according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera when it comes to studying Torah. How so? Rabbi Eli Reshit Hagez, Ditani Rabbi Eli Omer Reshit Hagez noheg el ba'aretz. Because according to Rabbi Eli, bringing the first shearings of the sheep, or bringing the lechayim v'keva, the different matanot that come from an animal, the zroa, lechayim v'keva, the different parts that you're supposed to give to the kohen, these only apply in the land of Israel. And so that's why we don't practice them outside the land of Israel. Otherwise, we would have to, all of the kosher, any kosher-owned farm, or Jewish-owned farm, would have to take the first shearing of the sheep and give it to the kohanim. But we follow Rabbi Eli, who said that only applies in Israel. Rabbi Yoshia bekilayim. We follow Rabbi Yoshua with regard to mixed seeds, kidechtiv, lo tizrak karmecha kilayim. Because he had said, lo tizrak karmecha kilayim, Rabbi Yoshia Omer, Rabbi Yoshia said, le'olam eno chayav ad sheyizrach kita usura v'chartan b'mapolet yad. That according to Rabbi Yoshia, the only time you have a prohibition of diverse seeds is when you have lo tizrak karmecha kilayim, when it's a vineyard and diverse seeds, which means you need two different species of seed, like chita u'se'ora, barley, wheat, and a grape seed for it to be considered kilayim. So that's a very lenient position, because that means that without the grape seed in there, or just the grape seed and one other thing, it's not going to be kilayim. You need three seeds mixed to create kilayim, and that lenient position became the accepted position. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera b'divrei Torah Detanya, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, we know, we follow him with regard to learning Torah, as it says in the Breita, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, and divrei Torah mekablin tum'ah, that the words of Torah are not susceptible to tum'ah. Therefore, we do not have to immerse in a mikveh. If somebody has marital relations, they don't have to immerse in a mikveh before they study Torah. That's in accordance with the rule of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Ki ataz ze'iri. When ze'iri came, whenever it says, by the way, so and so came, it means that they were from Israel. Okay? So when ze'iri came, he said, bitluan litviluta. He said that they canceled the idea of having to go to the mikveh to study Torah. Va'amrila, some say bitlua linetiluta. That what he said was they canceled the idea of netilat yadayim. According to the version that says that what Ze'iri reported was that they canceled the idea of immersion, that would support the idea of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. That would mean that they followed what Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said, that one who has marital relations does not need to go to the mikveh before learning Torah. The one who says that what they canceled was washing hands, kihadu Rav Chisda, like what Rav Chisda said, layit aman de me'ader amaya bidan silota, that he would curse somebody, anybody who would go looking after water at the time of prayer. In other words, that when it came to netilat yadayim for tefillah, we shouldn't be so strict that we lose out on the times of prayer because we're waiting to wash our hands or we're looking for water with which to wash our hands. So it doesn't mean that they canceled the idea of Netilat Yadayim completely, just that we shouldn't be so stringent about Netilat Yadayim before prayer that the prayer itself is lost as a result.
You have to spend 3 hours to be
Exactly, then you miss the whole thing. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Bal Keri Shinatnu Alav Tisha Kabin, Maim Tahor. That there's another trick that we now learn in the Gemara, which is you don't necessarily have to go to the mikveh. If you're a balkari, if somebody has had marital relations, they had a seminal emission, so such a person does not need to go to the mikveh. They can pour 9 kabin of water on themselves. Now you do the math. If we figure that a mikveh is 40 sa'ah of water, 40 sa'ah is somewhere between 87 and 150 gallons, depending on who you ask. Okay, let's say 100 gallons, whatever, somewhere in the middle. If you want to take an average, a 9 kabin is 1.5 sa'ah. So if 40 sa'ah is like 87 gallons, so 1.5 sa'ah is, you do the math, I can't do it in my head. Nachum ish gamzu, lechashel Rabbi Akiva. Nachum ish gamzu whispered this to Rabbi Akiva. Why did he want to whisper it to him? Because he didn't want people to know that there's a trick that you don't have to go to the mikveh. He wanted people to go to the mikveh, but just in case you're ever in trouble and you can't make it, just take a jug of 9 kabin and pour it a shower. Exactly. Rabbi Akiva lechashel ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva whispered this to Ben Azai. Ben Azai yatzav v'shana l'talmidav bashuk. But Ben Azai went and told everybody. Okay, so they're whispering in the beginning, but after a while Ben Azai told everybody. Pligi batrei amorai b'marava. 2 Amoraim argued in the west. The west refers to Israel when you're in Babylonia. Rabbi Yossi bar Ravin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zivida. Rabbi Yossi bar Ravin and Rabbi Yossi bar Zivida argued. Chad tanei shinna'a, v'chad tanei lechasha. One says he went out and taught it to his students in the shuk. The other one says that he whispered it to his students in the shuk. Meaning, although he publicized it more, he didn't totally publicize it to everyone. What's the reason? Man detanei shinna'a mishum bitul Torah. The version that says that he went and told everybody says that he was concerned about 2 things. Neglecting of reproduction and neglecting the study of Torah. Why? Because if a person has to go to the mikveh every time he has marital relations, one of 2 things will happen. Either he's never going to have marital relations and we're not going to have any families happening, or he's never going to learn Torah because he's going to say, well, I don't have time to go to the mikveh and I can't go, so I'm not going to learn Torah. So he wanted to go out and tell people, there's another solution to this. You can just pour tisha kabin, the 9 kabin. The other version says that no, Ben Azai only whispered it to the students because he didn't want everybody to know, because he wanted to discourage excess involvement in marital relations. It was better that people thought they had to go to the mikveh because then they would balance their priorities. Not too much of one thing, not too much of the other. They strike a balance, okay? Not to be like chickens, it says, like roosters, okay? Like roosters. So Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai says, Shamati shemekilin ba, Shamati shemachmirin ba. I've heard some people are stringent about going to the mikveh, some are lenient. If you can be stringent, your days and years will be lengthened. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Mativan shel tovlei shacharin. He said, what is the nature of all these people going to the mikveh in the morning before shacharit? How could he be asking such a question? Mativan. What do you mean, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? It was your drasha that taught us the idea that a balkari is not supposed to learn Torah. And now you're asking, where did they get the idea of going to the mikveh in the morning? This is what he meant. Why are they all going to the mikveh? When it's possible just to pour 1.5 sa'ah on yourself, or to take a shower, basically, and it would be enough. Why would they have to immerse when they could pour the water on themselves? Amar Rabbi Chanina said, Gader gadol gadruba. They made a great fence by requiring the mikveh. Why? Ditani, as it says in the Braita. There was once a man who propositioned a woman for a dvar avera, for a bad, an illicit activity. Amrallah, she said to him, Reka, you empty person, you loser, basically. Yesh lecha 40 sa'ah shetatovel behen. Are you going to go to the mikveh afterwards before you go to shacharit? And when he heard that, miyad peresh, he said, you know what? I'm out of here. You're right. So what do you see? It was a deterrent also to people who would be involved in illicit things. Amar lehu Rav Huna l'Rabbanan. Rav Huna said to the rabbis, Rabotai, my teachers, why are you so lenient about this immersion? If it's because it's too cold, so go to the bathhouse. Right? Why can't you just go to the bathhouse? Why do you need to go to the cold mikveh? Amar le Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said to him, what do you mean? You can go into a bath and that's a mikveh? A warm bath is a mikveh. Of course, we have heated mikvahot today, but he meant because it would normally be drawn water if it was a heated. They didn't have what we have, the technology that we have. So a real mikveh was cold. So this was a bath. You can't go into a bath for a mikveh. That's no good. Amar le Rav Adar bar Ahava kavatech. He said back to him, Rav Adar bar Ahava agrees with you, but Rabbi Zerah. But the point is that he's talking not about using the bath as a mikveh. He's talking about using the water of the bath to pour on himself as the tisha kabin. Okay, Rabbi Zerah Havayativ ba'agna demaya. Once upon a time, Rabbi Zerah was taking a bath. Be'masuta, in the bathhouse. Amar le l'shama'e zil vaiti li tisha kabin v'shadi ilavai. He said to him, "Bring me a jar or a jug with 9 kabin of water and pour it on me." Amar le Rabbi Chia bar Abba, lama le lemar klehai. Why do you need him to pour water on you? You're in the bath. Why do you need that? Vayativ b'gavayu. You're in the water. Amar le ke'arba'im sa'a. It's just like the mikveh. Ma arba'im sa'a, just like the 40 sa'a batvila can only work if you immerse. Velo benetina, you can't pour a mikveh on somebody. Lu yatzor, that you could pick up the entire mikveh and pour it on somebody, it's no good. Okay? So too, aftisha kabin, similarly with the 9 kabin, benetina velo betvila, you can't immerse in them, they have to be poured on you. So even though I'm in the bath, it's not good enough. It has to either be pouring of the 9 kabin, or it has to be immersing in the 40 se'ah. Rav Nachman tiken chatzva bat tisha kabin. This is a funny story. Rav Nachman made for himself a jug that was 9 kabin to use for this, to pour on himself. Very smart, right? Ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbi Yehuda glostera amru. So when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he said that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda glostera said, Lo shanu ela lechole la'onso, aval lechole amargil arba'im sa'a. That they said in Israel, that's only true if somebody has a seminal emission against their will. In other words, in their sleep. Then, and they're a choleh, and they're sick. Okay, but somebody who had marital relations, or a healthy person who had a seminal emission in his sleep, that person has to go to the mikveh. They don't have an excuse to use the tisha kabin. So Amar Rav Yosef, Idbar chatzvei de Rav Nachman. The jug of Rav Nachman has been broken. Meaning, he made that jug for nothing. Because unless he's sick and he has the emission in his sleep, in every other case, he has to go to the mikveh anyway. Kiyata Ravin, but when Ravin came from Israel, Amar be'usha hava ovda. He said in Usha, there was an event, Bekila de Rav Oshaya, Atu v'shalu Rav Asi, that in the antechamber, I guess you would call it, or on the portico of Rav Oshaya, they asked Rav Asi, Amar lahu lo shanu ela lechole amargil, aval lechole la'onso patur miklum. That Rav Asi had an even more lenient opinion than everybody else, or than we've seen up till now. And he said that a choleh margil can use the tisha kabin. In other words, if a person it doesn't have to be that you have 2 problems, right? Before what Rav Dimi said was that you have to be sick and it was against your will. But if you had relations, even if you're sick, you have to go to the mikveh. Okay? And if you're sick, even if it's not going to help you. So Rav Asi said, no, if you're sick, if you're feeling weak and you had relations, you can still use the tisha kabin. So what happened? Amar Rav Yosef said, it's tamir chatzvei de Rav Nachman. Now the jug of Rav Nachman was put back together, because he can use it. Okay, because if he's feeling weak, and he can't go to the mikveh, he can use it. But Rav Asi added another thing, that a choleh la'onso, if a person had the emission when he was sleeping, and he doesn't feel well, that person doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't even have to go to the mikveh, he doesn't need the 9 kabin, he doesn't need anything. So now we move forward with tonight, and we find that Ezra kamipalge, that they're actually arguing about the original nature of this whole institution of Ezra. How so? Because Ezra created this thing. Because they said, how did Ezra establish this? Amar Abaye said as follows: Ezra tiken labari margil memsa'a ubari lonso tet kabin. Ezra's original concept was a healthy person who has marital relations goes to the mikveh. A healthy person who has the emission in his sleep has 9 kabin. In other words, for a sick person, it didn't apply at all. Okay, it didn't apply at all. Va'atu amora'e upligi b'choleh. And the later rabbis came along and said, what about a sick person? One said it doesn't matter. We should apply the same rule. The original rule was one who had relations had to go to the mikveh, one who it was le'onso, one who had in their sleep would have the 9 kabin poured on him. And a sick person is the same. If the sick person had relations, they go to the mikveh. If the sick person had that in their sleep, then they pour the 9 kabin. The other view was that no, a sick person only is like a healthy person who has it in their sleep. In other words, he's one stage lower. And therefore, the sick person, even if he had relations, only needs the 9 kabin. And a sick person who had it in their sleep doesn't need anything. Amar Rava said to Abaye, Nehida tiken Ezra tevila. Nitina mitiken. What are you talking about, man? The whole idea of pouring 9 kabin wasn't from Ezra. That was later. Ezra only dealt with mikveh. Va'amar Ezra tiken tevila lebalei kiryam. That's all he had was tevila, immersion. Ela Amar Rava said like this. This was the evolution of the halacha. Ezra tiken tevila lebariya margil memsa'a. The original institution was that somebody who had relations and was healthy went to the mikveh. The rabbis came and said not only marital relations, which was the original halacha, but even somebody who had it in their sleep has to pour 9 kabin on themselves. And the rabbis came later and said, they said, well, what about if he's sick? What category should we put him in? Mar savar cholei margil kibari margil v'cholei laonso kibari laonso. Mar savar lebari margil memse'a v'cholei margil kibari laonso tet kabin. Aval lecholei laonso patur miklum. So basically, what they said was like this: that a person who's sick but has relations should be kibari margil, should be just like a regular healthy person who has relations. And a person who is sick and has it in their sleep should be just like a healthy person who has it in their sleep and should have to pour the 9 kabin on themselves. The other view was no, that a healthy person who has relations goes to the mikveh. A sick person can just pour the 9 kabin. But a sick person who has it in their sleep doesn't have anything. Okay? Now what's the final conclusion? Amar Rava hilchitak bariya margil v'cholea margil arba'im sa'a. Rava says, the bottom line is, whether you're sick or healthy, if you had relations, you have to go to the mikveh. Ubari laonso tisha kabin. And if you're healthy and you had it in your sleep, pour the 9 kabin, meaning take a shower, basically. Aval lecholea laonso. But a sick person who has it in their sleep, patur miklum. That's the conclusion. Now we're just going to do a little bit further, so we're up to tomorrow's daf. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, Bal kerish netnu alav tet kabin ma'im tahor, b'med devarim amurim le'atzmo. That a bal keri that they poured 9 kabin of water on him is tahor. When does that apply? For himself, if he wants to learn Torah to himself. Aval lachirim, but if he wants to teach others, arba'im sa'ah. Then he needs to go to the mikveh no matter what. So even if we're going to be lenient with him, that sometimes he can use this trick of the 9 kabin pouring on himself and he doesn't have to go to the mikveh, we're not going to say that with regard to teaching others. Rabbi Yehuda Omer memsab mikol makom. Rabbi Yehuda, who was the liberal one before, is now the stringent one. He says there's no such thing as 9 kabin. He always has to go to the mikveh, whether he wants to learn for himself or he wants to teach others. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. There was the group of four rabbis: Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. Chad mehai zuga v'chad mehai zuga aresha. So one from either of these pairs, we don't know which one was which. We know that one from the first pair and one from the second pair discussed the first half of the Mishnah, and one from the first pair and one from the second pair discussed the second half of the Mishnah. We're not exactly sure which is which. So Chad amar hada amrat. So this is what they said about the beginning. Hadamrat b'dvarim amurim la'atzmo aval lachirim mem se'ah lo shanu el lecholei margil aval lecholei